very beginning. And what about those similarities? I mean, why else would you have similar bones in the arm of a human, a bat, a dog, or a frog, unless they evolved from a common ancestor? But this brings us to the fourth reason why evolution is scientifically invalid. Appeals to circularity. Now, you interpret the data in an evolutionary context, and guess what? Voila! It comes out as evidence for evolution. Well, of course it would. I mean, why do we have these similar bones? It's because we have a common ancestor. And what is the evidence for a common ancestor? Similar bones. And I would suggest to you, listen carefully to all evolutionary arguments. I haven't found a one which isn't circular in nature. Appeals to events that have never been observed, appeals to mystifying explanation, appeals to extrapolations far beyond what the evidence will bear, and appeals to interpretations which are based on nothing but circular reasoning. But you know what? A lot of organisms have similar features which shouldn't have a common ancestor. Do you realize bats and whales have the exact same gene for echolocation? And as I read through the scientific paper, they said they were astounded that random genetic mutations had hit on the exact same genetic sequence down to the base. And it was just an amazing thing. And if you were to just look at that gene, bats and whales would pair together in an evolutionary tree. And they said, of course, but that isn't their real evolutionary cousins. So it doesn't fit the tree again. So how do they explain this? Through convergent evolution, not divergent from a common ancestor, but separate things converging on the same features. But do you know what convergent evolution is? It's a rhetorical rescuing device to salvage evidence which doesn't fit the evolutionary tree and force it into an evolutionary context. It's not something that's really there, that you really see in any ways. So how in the world do we know whether these similar features are due to a common ancestor or convergence? And why should we believe any of those explanations, either one of those? But what about those similarities in DNA? Now, this is a fascinating part. This is totally new. The Bible says common design, as Dr. Giverson mentioned. And we begin with these prepositions, that life is designed, as in Romans 1, life is discontinuous, and we're sharing this planet together. And so, just as in man-made things, you see a similar function, similar design, with similar plans, tools, materials, and environment, we would see the same thing with God-made things. Similar functions for have a similar design. Not just between that man and that woman that you see there, but between that horse. And that's actually a picture of me running a marathon last week, and me right there. Why do we have these similar features? This is great. In 1975, before we even had this great genetic sequencing capability, Dr. Henry Morris wrote, in the creation model, the same similarities are predicted on the basis of a common purposeful designer. We're looking for that common information that's going to underline the common design. From the evolutionary worldview, though, they have this tree of life. And this is what's amazing, because you're not going to hear this in the evolutionary story today. Ernst Mayr explained in 1963, much has been learned about gene physiology that makes it evident that the search for similar, the homologous genes is quite futile except in close relatives. So evolution did not predict these similarities before we could look back. In fact, they said because organisms have been evolving and the mutations have been happening, these creatures and these creatures, these diverse creatures, should have very, very different genetics. So here's a great opportunity. Before we have a way to test it, creationists made a prediction, evolutionists made a prediction. Two very different predictions. And what does the science say? Well, between 1978 and 1984, some phenomenal, groundbreaking papers were published in which they analyzed genes which were coding for, incredibly, almost entire structures, such as an eye, and these genes were called Hox genes. Well, evolutionary developmental biologist Sean Carroll reports on it this way. He said, it was inescapable. Clusters of Hox genes shaped the development of animals as different as flies and mice. And now we know that includes just about every animal in the kingdom, including humans and elephants. The implications were what? Stunning. Disparate animals were built using not just the same kinds of tools, but indeed the very same genes. He goes on to say, the evolutionary lines that led to flies and mice diverged more than 500 million years ago. No biologist, catch this, no biologist had the foggiest notion that such similarities could exist between genes of such different animals. The Hox genes were so important that their sequence had been preserved throughout the enormous span of evolution. Stunning confirmation of the creationist prediction. We're looking for the information, and when the technology developed, we found the information. The common information for these common designs was right there in the Hox genes. And I'd like you to look carefully at that quote. Right at the very end, he makes a quick slip. You know that convergent evolution? It's dumped overboard. That firmly held belief in convergent evolution, completely gone, and now it's replaced with conservation. Now these genes are so important that they have survived 500 million years unchanged. And what's incredible is some evolutionists say, since we have similar genes as bacteria, some of these genes have survived for 3 billion years unchanged, while the rest of the genetics goes mutating on. Wow. That is a counterintuitive and mystifying explanation. And you know, it's kind of like this. Heads I win, tails you lose. Now my brother did that to me when I was about 5 years old. He was flipping me for my Easter jelly beans. I wondered why he got every single one of those jelly beans, because he was doing the heads I win, tails you lose. That was just about the same time he told me that mom and dad really weren't my parents, but that I was bought at Goodwill for 50 cents and something there. Well, on this particular point, the Bible was right again. Common design information specifies similar design in organisms, and not only were the creationist predictions right, the evolutionary thinking in its prediction, based on a consistent view, was totally dead wrong. Totally dead wrong on this prediction.